Welcome, Phil Strazzulla from Select Software Reviews. I'm very, very excited to talk to you today because I have a million questions about what it is that you do and your perspective on HR tech. Our general focus always is in SMB. And so, I want to keep the theme a little bit around, how HR recruiting tech can help small and mid-sized businesses drive business results. And so we'll try to tie back to that theme. And to get started, Phil, just tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us about Select Software Reviews. And I'm really just very curious how you ended up starting this company and why you gravitated towards this niche.
Yeah, sounds good. I'll try to keep it concise. And it's, of course, a story full of randomness. I started my career off working in venture capital at this firm called Bessemer Venture Partners. And we did a bunch of HR tech investments like LinkedIn or Cornerstone On Demand, but I wasn't involved in any of them. And, that was sort of just very coincidental. I always wanted to start a company. So I applied to business school. I got my MBA at Harvard. And while I was there, I started teaching myself how to program and started working on a bunch of different projects, one of which turned into an employer branding SaaS. So it was when Glassdoor was sort of getting started or getting big, I would say. And a lot of companies were like, oh my God, all our worst employees are talking about us on the internet. And I was really into career pathing. Why do people go to one career to the next or whatever? And so I said, here's a platform where your employees can talk about, how to become an account rep at your company or whatever. And then you can take those stories and you can post them on your website, your social. And so Brennan and I started that business, and that's sort of how I got into HR tech. And 5 years into that company, I wanted to do something else. So I hired somebody to run it as a general manager to free myself up. And I love to learn. I love to teach. I saw that most of the companies that we had partnered with, most of the HR teams that we partnered with in my previous business were really struggling with tool selection. So anything from what ATS should I buy through, there's this new AI thing. How do we use it? What does it even mean? How do we think about pricing? How do I get my boss to say yes? All the stuff around tools was really complicated. And I just thought, hey, could I start a company to help people figure out what tools to buy, give them the right information in an unbiased way. And that's what SSR is. So we have a team of editors that just spend all day long talking to users, like HR and recruiting people in the trenches. They talk to experts who are usually people who are working across lots of different companies, usually a consultant who does TA for Fortune 500 or employee experience for startups or whatever. And then we also talk to the vendors, and we try to talk to senior people at the vendors to understand what's your product strategy? How do you actually stack up next to your competitors? And then we write up what we hope are the best pieces of content online about individual solutions, as well as the sort of broader advice around, how do I buy an ATS? What questions should I ask on demos? How should I deal with the sales reps? How should I negotiate my contract? How should I implement this? How do I think about ROI? How do I evangelize the ROI so that my boss thinks I'm a rock star and I can buy the next thing?
And I think that's a good segue, right? I mean, I guess I'm probably biased about this, but I think of talent acquisition as a revenue generating activity for organizations, or talent management, in general, how you recruit, how you retain, how you develop, how you people within the organization is really a revenue generating. And so that's where kind of the idea of this topic came up, is driving business results, right? So how do you mentioned that a little bit in kind of your discussion here. How do you tie those two things back together? And when you're working with HR recruiting teams or talent acquisition teams, how do you link those two things together typically?
Yeah, so this is something that I always think about, because I think a lot of times companies don't treat their HR and recruiting teams fairly, simply because it's like, hey, if we pump more money into sales, the sales will go up, right? If we put more money into product, the revenue is going to increase. It's very much like one-to-one. And people don't make the leap to understand like, oh, putting money into talent acquisition allows us to grow sales for whatever
You
reason.
gotta hire good salespeople, otherwise it doesn't do you any good, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I have a suspicion that for whatever reason, like a lot of people get in HR recruiting are more humble and they're not as good about bragging and internal evangelizing. I had this fourth grade teacher who was always like, brag about yourself, brag about yourself. And like, I think like there's that component to it. I think it's also a little bit more complicated because it's not a direct tie. And so we have a page on our website that goes into excruciating detail on lots of different solutions. If you Google probably like HR tech ROI, SSR, there's like calculators, there's videos, there's Excel spreadsheets, like there's a lot there. But in my opinion, like from a TA perspective, there's a few different drivers of value that the like sort of cold-hearted CFO will care about. One is time to fill. So if you decrease time to fill, that's more time that a salesperson is in their seat or an engineer, customer success, whoever it is in the organization. And that person, if the company is a good capital allocator, is going to drive lots of value. How much value are they going to drive? A good rule of thumb is 2x their salary, sort of like their all-in comp. So if you think about a business that, most businesses have at least a 50% gross margin. Many have at least a 20 or 30% net margin. So you can kind of just double that.
You could at least ballpark it that way by using that number.
Yeah, it's a good way to ballpark for roles that aren't as obvious. For something like a salesperson, it's just like, hey, what's sort of the incremental gross profit that this person is supposed to bring in the first year? Divide that by 250 working days. Therefore, the value per day is X.
Yeah.
And what you'll find is, your average quota-bearing sales rep is probably like a 4 or 5X, like what they're supposed to bring in relative to their salary, which is sort of in keeping with this, 2 to 3X conservative rule of thumb. And so if you decrease time to fill by 4 days times 100 sales reps times, 4 or 5K per day, that's $1 million, right?
And so you see CEOs, I mean, I think if you ask any CEO, what is the most important asset to your business, you would think probably 80 to 90% of them would first say people, their people, right? Some of them might say their product, how nifty it is, but then the second thing they would say is their people probably, right? Or something that ties back to that.
Yeah.
But do you think, do you think they give it the attention that it needs ultimately in reality?
I think interestingly, like there's just like a culture of under-resourcing HR. Like HR is just like always thought of as a cost center. And I think that there's lots of implications of that, but at the end of the day, most management teams would agree with, people is up there, top 3 for sure. And we're going to like under-resource the team that's like in charge of people. Like that doesn't make a lot of sense. I think why that happens is most executives have a really bad association with HR in their brain. Most people, HR is the pencil pushers, they're the rule keepers, they're the people that weren't really that excited about any other career path and they just sort of stumbled in HR. And I think that's why you've seen this like people operations moniker pop up. I was actually talking to somebody in the UK the other day and they started off like it was personnel, then it was resources, then it was human resources, and now it's people operations. So every like 15 years, every 15 years it like sheds its skin and it tries to start anew. I think with people ops, like we're seeing this is being treated as a brand new thing. And so for example, a person reached out to me a few weeks ago who's at Harvard Business School right now, and they're graduating this year and they want to get an HR. And I was like, that's crazy. Like you want to do HR? They're like, yeah, there's like, 15 or 20 of us that want to do HR. And I was like, that when I graduated 10 years ago, there were 0 people. Like it wasn't, I don't think it was like not even a word on anybody's lips. Right. Now there's 20 and maybe 10 years from now, there'll be 100 and that's 10% of the class.
But do you think the talent pool really understands what it means to be an effective HR or talent? So I think to me, there's a very distinct difference between HR and talent acquisition. There's a lot of sub roles within HR, right? That have very distinctly different roles or strategies in order to execute those roles effectively. But I mean, do you think young people or people in general really understand what it means to be in HR?
I don't think so. And I think that could be a good thing. So I've got a friend who is a very senior HR person at a Fortune 500, and she was hired into a completely different role, and they just needed her to like run campus recruiting, where they hired like 500 or 600 people a year. And she went in there, she didn't know anything, right?
Yeah.
And within one campus recruiting cycle, she had like drastically increased the effectiveness of the on-campus recruiting function.
So
Like,
she didn't come from an HR background. She came from a different business function.
I think she worked in private equity.
Yeah.
Or something, some sort of either that or consulting, some sort of like business background.
Yeah.
And she just came in, she's like, I don't know anything about on-campus recruiting, except like we want to get really good people.
Yeah.
So why are we going to like this wrong set of schools and having like really bad marketing and having a really slow process and having really bad compensation and having no
very like business executive type strategy type questions in her own mind, like why are we doing it this way? She rethought it and then created a new process that aligned more in the way you would think about any process that you're implementing in a business, how it's aligning with the mission and the vision or the goals of the organization, and kind of rethought it then, right?
Yeah, just from first principles. And, now this person who like didn't even know what, on-campus recruiting was, like now she's the number 2 HR person at this very large company, and she's 36 or whatever. And so it's like, oh, that's pretty impressive. And if she had like an HR background, she's like, well, here's how you do campus recruiting. Probably wouldn't have been as successful.
Yeah. Well, I definitely, like this conversation. I really think HR, and talent and all the sub aspects of it, but it really should be thought of as a key function within a business from a revenue generating perspective and a production perspective. And I just think that it's an often overlooked part of the role and the conversation. And I think everybody, the people who are in HR and as well as the C-suite executives, need to be, constantly refocusing on how they think about it. But let's shift gears a little bit. So I was curious what your feelings were about, say, an enterprise HR technology versus HR technology geared more for that SMB. How would you characterize those? And what would be the key differences you think that you would typically look for in those, if you had to differentiate an enterprise solution versus more of an SMB solution?
Yeah, I think what's nice about the SMB solutions is like they're much more usable. So enterprise, in many ways, these companies are designing around the procurement process. So if you look at like Workday or SAP, they're trying to check all the boxes that the procurement person has so that they can win the contract, and it's a $400,000, $1 million annual contract. And many times the end user who's actually going to like be in the system all day long, they're not even in the conversation, right? It's the chief information officer, it's some sort of like executive person, or it's a third-party consultant or a combination. Versus SMB, you usually have the end user who's buying it. They're going to demo it. They're going to be more hands-on. Many times they're going to have access to a free trial. They're going to be much more user focused, and they're going to be really focused on integrations with the ecosystem of tools that they have. So you might be using Jazz HR versus SAP for your ATS. And so that's the stuff you care about. And so the SMB software in general ends up being much better. Doesn't have, the SOC 2 and the SSO and like all this other stuff. But it's usually better software. Yeah.
So you find it's just more user friendly then, or?
That's right. Yeah. And it doesn't take, 8 months to get set up, and it's usually changing much faster too. Like we're seeing the non-enterprise solutions like integrate, AI much faster. So
that was one of my next questions. So you brought it up. I mean, what would be like the top like couple of AI tools in HR tech that you're seeing that you think are really truly game changers, I guess?
I think the talent sourcing aspect of things is greatly enhanced by artificial intelligence. So like right now, you just have to kind of think about like, what can these tools do and what can't they do?
Yeah.
And if you don't have an intuition about that, like you should just sign up for ChatGPT and just start like messing around with it.
Yeah.
That's actually what I did last week with a group of HR people. It was a lot of fun because none of them had opened it yet. I think a lot of people were afraid of this technology, and we just kind of opened it up. We were on a webinar and we just opened it up and started like, inserting prompts and stuff. It's kind of cool. But I think right now, like this technology can redirect, understand what is this, what sort of job is it? Who would be a good fit for it? It can make a list of those people and it can email those people. And it can even answer a couple of like simple questions or ask like some knockout questions or whatever, and then it can schedule.
Yeah.
So like for that part of the talent acquisition cycle, super awesome technology. For the interviewing and assessment, like maybe not as much because it's just not good at understanding lots of unstructured data.
Yeah.
It's not something you'd want to trust with who's going to get hired or not from a compliance perspective, as well as from a culture or just like quality of hire perspective. I think it's really great at data. So, right now, if you're in HR and you're trying to understand like who are the, I don't know, 30 executives that have risen through the ranks the fastest in the last 4 quarters, that's like a really hard problem to solve.
You could just feed it all the data about those people and say, hey, what do these people have in common or something, right?
Yeah, imagine on your performance management system and this stuff's being built, like just being able to feed it a natural query like that. You don't need to know SQL. It's just like, what are the characteristics of I don't know, top performing sales managers, right? So that sort of analysis is really interesting. And then I think there'll be like a lot of automations. So there are a couple of companies that have built their own essentially chatbots before this sort of technology was more open source.
Yeah.
And they're able to, do things like answer common employee questions or convert people more effectively on a career site.
Yeah. Yeah. Engagement. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about AI in recruiting in particular. I mean, I'm a recruiting guy. I'm a talent acquisition guy, but and a talent assessment person kind of first and foremost, even prior to the recruiting side. And I came up with a list of like 20 different things you can use AI for. It's amazing. And one, I think my biggest epiphany is, we see a lot of job advertisements and a lot of like marketing material that, that they sadly call job descriptions and they use to market jobs, right? And one of the very first applications is just like, let's just write a better marketing content, right, to attract our ideal candidate. And it just does such a remarkable job of transforming this random data that you can just pull right off your website or off of video testimonials. So you were in the employee testimonial or review, business, right? So you could just pull that content and just say, hey, write a better job ad for me, right? Or create 20 social posts or create an employee referral program, and boom, in like 5 minutes, you can have some really robust marketing content that, again, I think it ties back to that earlier conversation. Most HR people, they weren't trained as sales and marketing people, but program and boom, in like recruiting.
Yeah, I was just opening up our feed. I was curious if we're getting any questions in the feed.
Yeah, maybe I don't know if you've seen any there, but Emilio's hopefully monitoring, can drop them in the Zoom chat for us. But yeah, I thought that was pretty interesting. I mean, because you're not trained for those things. They're not copywriter. I'm not a copywriter. I've never thought, if you're an HR person, you don't often think about these things. And then even just the act of having to write a job advertisement. I mean, if I asked you to write a job advertisement for a role in your organization today, and you think about the million other things that you've got going on, whether you're an HR person or a business owner or a hiring manager tasked with this task, where do you start, right? You start with a blank piece of paper, or maybe you Google it and you steal one from your competitor or something, which I hate that. Don't do that, please. But it's a time-consuming process, right? Like,
Yeah.
it might take you an hour or 2 hours, but just getting started can be the hardest part, I think, right?
Yeah, it really can, especially, yeah, if you're just not used to writing, like, and to your point, it's like not the skill set. And a lot of these job descriptions they're a C- at best.
Yeah.
And so like you might be worried about, if you're like a true writer, like maybe you're not relying on ChatGPT, because you're like, well, the grammar and the this, that, and the other thing. But like for most of us, like if you can take a C- to an A- in 2 seconds for free, like why not do that?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think, and I think you mentioned it before. I mean, obviously, anything we're doing with AI still requires that human sort of oversight, right? To make sure that it's accurate, that it's not doing anything it's not supposed to be doing, that, you don't just blindly trust it, right? But I think, that experience is exactly that. It takes things from C- to A-, and, the best analogy I can give to AI is, it's the smartest intern you're ever going to hire.
Yeah.
I hired interns from like Princeton, and the challenge was, versus the Cal State intern. I mean, maybe they were 5 or 10% better in terms of the work quality that they produced, but it was still maybe only getting me 60% of the way that I needed to. If you give them a task, a project, right? They go and do the project, and they get it like 60% correct, right? Well,
Yeah.
I or somebody else still has to come in and finish the job, right? Which is a huge task. Where AI is getting you like 80 to 90% to where you need to be, and way faster, and obviously way less expensive than an intern. Now, an intern with ChatGPT, I don't know, maybe they got some superpowers there.
Yeah. It's a good way to put it. It's not quite the full-time employee level,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
it's getting you close.
Yeah, at least on certain tasks. Yeah. So, maybe this is kind of twofold, but I mean, I suppose, what makes recruiting software great, or what makes it terrible? And keep in mind business results.
Yeah. I think, the business results aspect of things is just going to go hand in hand with great software, because you're going to just, whatever the key metric is for you, whether it's time to fill, whether it's cost per hire, quality of hire, like you're going to increase that, and you're going to increase it better with better software. For me, like the most important criteria are usability. So that's from an admin as well as a user perspective, and candidate, if relevant, or employee. That's really important. And I think you should pull in different stakeholders throughout the demo process. If you're doing if you're just doing something with a free trial, like that's one thing. But if you're going to pay, $5,000-10,000+ a year, you're probably going to pull in a couple of internal stakeholders and just have people ask the questions. Hey, here's my existing workflow. How do you do this in this tool?
Mhm.
I think that price is obviously important. That's the denominator in the ROI calculation. And so, something costs 10,000, only gives you 15, not as good as something that's $1,000. Time is a big part of that cost as well. I think it's a hidden cost that people don't always think about. Something might, cost $10,000 a year, but if you're spending hundreds of hours, or you need an FTE to run it,
Yeah.
then that's a huge sort of hidden cost. And it's also just brain damage, and something you don't want to deal with. I think the other is like, can you be really confident that something ties back to a business result? So, for example, I think a lot of HR software, it's sort of wishy-washy, right? It's like, we implemented employee wellness technology, and so people can share how they're feeling and get like help where they need it.
Yeah.
And we think that that'll increase employee retention. Employee retention went up 2% last year. Was it due to that? Is that a statistical just sort of aberration? Like what's going on there versus, hey, we used to spend $300,000 a quarter on third-party recruiters. We implemented a new sourcing tool. Now we spend $20,000. We're pretty darn sure that 280 is gone from the sourcing tool. Now, I'm not saying that the employee wellness solution can't give you that ROI, because you might just be more sophisticated around, hey, the people who engage with this, the retention for those people was actually 40% higher. And so on a weighted average, it went up by 2%, but all it means is we actually just need to increase the percentage of people who are engaging with this thing. So, there's different ways of slicing and dicing this, but the things that are more wishy-washy, it's hard to have that confidence.
Yeah, and I feel like we find that a lot in talent assessment. Companies get into using different assessment techniques, and they're excited about it at first, and they implement and they use it, and then it's always 6 to 12 months later. Then we always come back to people and say, okay, well, give us the data, right? Like how did things perform, right? And I don't know if it's like the excitement dies off, but like nobody wants to do the task with 20-minute task of pulling the data, right? They're not tracking it. Maybe that's why it's hard, because it's not being tracked to begin with.
Yeah.
Or again, just that extra task of analyzing the data, comparing the outcomes, and that could be productivity, retention, employee satisfaction, employee surveys, doing performance management reviews. Whatever it is, right? There's lots of different metrics and data that you can use to correlate back to your to whatever tool that you're using, right? Whether it's that wellness program or it's a better ATS with the sourcing or whatever it is, right? There's plenty of back-end data that should be available, but taking that time to link back and to be constantly measuring those results with those hard metrics. So, how do we solve that problem, I guess, in HR? Because it is such a squishy subject. We're dealing with people here, right?
Yeah.
And how do we do a better job of measuring results?
I think it's all about incentives. So the companies that I've seen do the best job of this, it's just like the C-level is like, hey, you got to do this, or else like we'll find somebody else who will run this analysis. And because it's always going to be a pain in the neck, it's always going to be something you don't want to do. And so there's the stick. The carrot is, as an individual, if you're able to do this, then you're going to have a lot more internal juice to go do the other stuff you want to do, right? So if you go to the C-suite or the rest of the exec team, you're like, hey, we spent whatever, 50 grand on a new sourcing technology, and we decreased our third-party recruiter spend by $1 million last year. Everybody's gonna be like, wow, you're a rock star. So when you want to, update the career website or redo your diversity strategy or whatever, like you're gonna get the money for that. Because people are like, there's that rock star, like doing the rock star thing again. So that's the carrot aspect of things. It's just like really hard because you usually have to learn new skill set. You got to pull data from disparate places. It's easy to mess it up. I think from an entrepreneur, perspective, like what I would do in your situation is I would do the analysis for them. So I'd like go to their office or get on a Zoom and do it, and or like give them a significant discount on the renewal and just say like to 3 companies, like, hey, we want to get 3 case studies. First 3 companies that do this, we'll give you $1,000 off. Or we'll pay for you to go to HR Tech this year and like put you up in a hotel in Vegas or something like that. But yeah, people don't want to do the analysis, which is, against their own self-interest, but I think a lot of people are just kind of checking in, checking out.
Yeah. Well, I like that, tying it back to, it's sort of back to the early story, right? Brag about yourself, right? So take the time to do the analysis so that you can brag about your accomplishment, and that accomplishment is probably enlarged by the individual, leveraging tools or good ideas and actually going out and doing something. Those tools and technologies are, exactly that. They're just tools in that journey. So, at the end of the day, they implement a tool, but they take action and they work to lower their external recruiting costs, and they accomplish that, then it's about bragging about it, right? So, I love that. You know, anytime you implement a new tool in your business, think ahead to how am I going to measure its results so that I can brag about it in a month or 3 months or 12 months from now, and show everybody how great of an idea this was and this new process was, right? So awesome. Well, I got a ton of questions here, but for the sake of time, you know, I always like to ask this before I wrap anything up, but what would be kind of 3 things that you know, somebody, an HR person or executive in a small and medium-sized business can implement tomorrow to begin improving their hiring outcomes and driving better business results?
I think first piece of advice would be to map your candidate journey. So understand at a pretty deep level, like, who are the people who are trying to work at your business, slash that you would want to work at your business, and how are they first getting exposed to your employer brand? How are they researching your employer brand? What does that application look like? What does the application follow-up look like, et cetera? And you're going to start to realize, like, oh, wow, like, you know, first place they go is Glassdoor results are terrible. First place they go is their career site sucks. You know, the second thing they do is they apply for a job and our applicant tracking system, blah, blah, blah. It takes us 3 weeks to get in touch with them. And, you know, when you really map that out, like, you start to have a lot more empathy for your candidates. I think the next thing is to understand your employee value props. So, like, you know, there's lots of layoffs, obviously. We're in sort of, you know, inning whatever of a recession. But unemployment's still 3.5%-ish. And so there's still a war, especially for certain types of talent. And the war, you know, will intensify, I'm sure, as the economy kind of comes back, however long that takes. And so you really need to understand why your company is a great place to work, and then put that into your job descriptions. Have ChatGPT, you know, work in that you're remote first, or you've got a great benefits plan or whatever. Put that on your career site, and put some negative stuff in there too, right? Like, for us, like, we're a startup, and you want the person who wants to work
at hats or something, right?
What's that? What's that?
You wear a lot of hats in a startup, and it can be overwhelming, right?
Sure. Yeah, exactly. It's, you know, priorities shift. Like, you don't have a job. Like, you have like it's sort of like zone defense, right? It's like, this is sort of the stuff you're doing, and maybe you're covering this person on this play and this person the next play. And so put some of that negative stuff in there too. It creates authenticity. It also is going to save you a lot of time and effort. And then I think you got to start looking at your tooling and just understand, like, where are the biggest leverage points for ours? Is it top of funnel? We just need more people. Let's look at programmatic. Let's look at sourcing. Is it the sort of process and speed of process? Maybe that's an ATS thing and building in more automations. Is it assessments? And we're just spending a ton of time with our recruiters on the phone with the wrong people. Let's have an assessment layer in there. So yeah, just start to think about, how do we leverage different tools to drive business results?
Yeah. Okay, one bonus question I forgot to ask earlier, but I was dying to ask this one, because this is kind of one of my new fixations. Can we virtually or almost completely automate the hiring process and keep candidate engagement or the candidate experience, or make it a high quality experience for the candidate at the same time? Can we do it today? If not, do you think we can do it in the future?
So the answer is, it depends on the type of role. So for right now, like, for high volume roles, from application to hire, there are some companies where it's 90 minutes.
Yeah.
And
like the whole thing.
The whole thing, yeah, to signing the offer letter. And that's a good candidate experience, because that person typically, you know, the sort of like high volume person, like, they need a job, they apply for 5 or 6 jobs. It's all commodity, right? Like, I just want to make X per hour. Yeah. Person who texts me fastest, the person who gets me through the interview process, and the person who gives me the job that can show up tomorrow or next week. That's what I want. That's like a really high quality process. It's sort of like buying something on the internet. Like when I buy a pair of pants, like I don't want to talk to somebody. You know what I mean? If I buy a house,
wait a week.
What's that?
Or wait a week, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. Now, if I buy a house, like I want to talk to somebody, I want somebody to walk me through it. I want somebody to explain to me like the pros and cons of the neighborhood and the schools and all this stuff. And that's more like the, senior level jobs or some of these like more skills on jobs. And I think for something like that, I don't think we're going to be close probably in at least 10 years. I think it's safe in the next 10 years, we're not going to be able to automate that. And by the time we can automate that, I don't know how many of these jobs will exist. Because if you can automate,
like developer jobs or things like that, a lot of it will be greatly reduced to some of the technology, right?
Sure. Or even it's like if a computer can understand if somebody's a good CMO, there are no CMOs. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like
the computer's doing the CMO job for us at that point.
Exactly. And the amount of wealth in the world is either extremely high or extremely low. Is my opinion. So
yeah, well, that's a whole nother conversation. But I spent a lot of time at SHRM conferences before COVID talking about income inequality, but nobody really wanted to hear about it. So here we are with extreme wage inflation and people freaking out. But off we go. We'll have to. It's going to be a never-ending battle. But finally, some things are shifting with low unemployment and such a high demand for talent that they're starting to see some of that shrink a little bit. But yeah, it's interesting to see what will happen there. But interesting.
Yeah.
Well, look, Phil, where can somebody find you? Where's the best place to connect? And Emilio, if you can, drop that in the chat. But we'll at least in the when we share this with our audiences, we'll have all that information in there. And on the reposting, we'll repurpose this in some articles and into some social posts. But yeah, Phil, how do you like to be contacted?
Yeah, so our website is selectsoftwarereviews.com. I'm an easy person to find on LinkedIn, Phil Strazzulla with 2 Z's and 2 L's. And those are, I think, the best ways.
Nice. Awesome. Well, Phil, thank you for chatting with me today. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing you again in the future, and keeping tabs on some of your posts there. I saw your one over the weekend. I had to give you a bit of a hard time. So zoom with the camera on or off. I'm a full on always guy, but no, I get so had to chime in there. But I'll look forward to seeing you out there, and thank you for your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. See ya. Bye.